Transform all your company's milestones, big or small, into impact with Impact Hero. Whether it's a sale, a new hire, a demo booked, or anything else, with Impact Hero, you automatically generate a gift that matters, like a tree planted, a kilo of plastic recovered, or a piece of coral reef restored. Join the hundreds of companies that are already boosting sales and retention while making an impact. Go to impacthero.com/podcast now to get 10% off. Again, that's impacthero.com/podcast to get 10% off.
I was really fascinated by how my own firsthand lived experience of the tragedies of what had happened there mapped onto or were in contrast with some of the international media coverage that I read about later. And so I started to get interested in how can we start to systematically understand where there are these differences and how can we work to improve accuracy and improve good coverage of these sorts of extreme events, of other climate-related events.
Welcome to another Climate Tech podcast, interviews with the people trying to save us from ourselves. Max Boykoff is a professor of environmental studies at the University of Colorado and is interested in how everyone from regular people to media to politicians talk about climate. He's also a big believer in using comedy to help people think about climate change. I reached Max in Boulder, Colorado. I'm Ryan Grant Little. Please take 5 seconds to rate and subscribe to this podcast, and thanks, as always, for being here. Max, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Ryan. Happy to be here.
You are a professor in environmental studies at the University of Colorado in beautiful Boulder. Can you talk a little bit about kind of your educational and professional background and how it led you to being a professor in this very interesting topic?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, there's a very long story that I could retell, but I suppose maybe fast forwarding into a short version is that I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, went to university at Ohio State and moved around, lived in Portland, Oregon in the Northwest. But then I joined the U.S. Peace Corps and was working in agriculture there. And an inflection point in my life was that towards the end of my time there in southern Honduras, Category 5 hurricane had come through in late 1998, Hurricane Mitch. And it was a moment that was shocking on several levels. And as I returned to the United States, I had many questions about how could I make sense of what was going on at the human-environment interface. That led me into working in agriculture again in Central California, but then started to sit in on some classes at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And I couldn't keep my mouth shut, was asking questions, sitting in on agroecology classes. And one of the professors said, you know what? You could come in here and do a PhD and ask these questions all day long. And so I thought of that as an amazing opportunity. And so I enrolled there, finished my PhD. During that period of time, pivoted into looking at media representational practices, the way that media cover climate change, what that means for the range of our attitudes, our perspectives, our beliefs, and our behaviors around climate change, media being a bridge into our everyday lives from those spaces of science and policy. And it's led me into looking at several different avenues of how media cover climate change, and then also brought me into the creative spaces of how we can engage with these different media to meet people where they are and to leverage positive change.
Yeah, that's really one of the things that caught my eye about your work. So, a lot of people I talk to who are in academia on the environmental side tend to be kind of on the more technical side, right? But you're really talking about messaging, policy, governance, those types of things when it comes to climate. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of what angles you're approaching those topics with respect to climate?
Sure. Part of that experience that I described briefly in Honduras in the late 90s was that I was really fascinated by how my own firsthand lived experience of the tragedies of what had happened there mapped onto or were in contrast with some of the international media coverage that I read about later. And so I started to get interested in how can we start to systematically understand where there are these differences and how can we work to improve accuracy and improve good coverage of these sorts of extreme events, of other climate-related events. And it brought me into looking at news coverage of climate change. And since then, I've developed a network with researchers around the world. There's about 24 of us that do monthly monitoring of media coverage of climate change or global warming. It's the Media and Climate Change Observatory. Folks want to look that up. And then in addition to that, I moving into the creative spaces, co-founded a group called Inside the Greenhouse here with a theater professor, a communication professor, and an ecology and evolutionary biology professor to then create this experimental space with our students to find new avenues for making connections around climate-related topics. And so we've delved into a range of issues such as fast fashion as it relates to sustainable fashion, and comedy as a vehicle for opening up conversations about climate engagement and action. And so those are a few examples of the kinds of things that we've been doing here that it's mapped onto. I engage in climate science and policy, endeavors all the time. I was a contributing author to the most recent IPCC assessment report, and I've been participating in climate negotiations now for several years, international climate negotiations. And so it's plugged into these spaces as it influences the way in which people are considering science and its application in everyday life. It's plugged in terms of the way in which policy actors are then creating and moving forward with different policies that actually are resonant, useful, meaningful, and productive for their constituencies.
There are a few things to unpack there. So kind of the role between, or the sort of loop between regular people and policy, humor, which I really want to talk about in depth as well. And then, as you mentioned, kind of the media and how it's covering that. So let's go through all three of those. Can you talk a little bit about this? So you've written quite a bit about kind of people's everyday lives and their sense of purpose and how that feeds into the kind of science and decision making, and then how that science and decision making feeds back into other, to people's regular lives. So kind of this loop. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Sure. Well, maybe the crumbs of the short story I told about how I entered into all this is helpful, and that I was an everyday person just trying to make sense of how we understood our place at the human environment interface and how certain policy measures were shaping the spectrum of possible decisions that we can make, be them individually, be them collectively. And so at the time, I was thinking about it through agricultural practices, through choices of farming, and all kinds of other related pieces there. And I sought to make sense and help build up the connectivity between research that's going on within the sciences, research about policy successes, and then how that influences people's lives. And so there is a back and forth in that the processes within science, the priorities are driven and guided by some semblance of public interest, public pressure, public needs. And same with policies, is that policies are designed based on what is viewed as priorities within their constituencies, within the general public. And so I've been moving in different ways over time through environmental studies, through environmental sciences, through some other disciplines as well, to help build up and strengthen connectivity between these spaces.
I work with a lot of companies who plan to open up shop in or expand across Europe. My one big piece of advice: don't fall into the trap of setting up a new entity right away. Instead, talk to my friends at Paracar, who can help you get up and running without all the costs, not to mention the legal and HR hassle. When I was hiring in different EU countries, I wanted my team to focus on their work, not on the country's bureaucracy. After interviewing a half-dozen international expansion firms, I chose Paracar because they were by far the most knowledgeable, and they're great people. Whether you're a large multinational looking to expand abroad, a small business looking for the right talent, or a contractor, they'll sort it out. Book a free, no-obligation consultation right now at paracar.eu/climate. That's PARAKAR.eu/climate. Have you looked at all? So, that loop works really well when the constituency has kind of views, and then the policymakers reflect those views and enact policies that that work that way. But then there's this spoiler that, this wild card that's been cropping up more and more, and that's lobbyists, right? And these, astroturf groups and that type of thing that we're seeing more and more of. I'm imagining this is probably something you're looking at pretty closely as well.
Yeah, so necessarily, because we're talking about ideal conditions here, is that as it mapped onto realities, particularly here in the United States, I know that your listeners are around the world, but here in the United States, being the belly of the beast, if you will, around carbon-based industry, that when it comes to lobbying, that plays a big part. And so it's drawn me into research. It's drawn me into work that looks at how climate obstruction impedes policy action here in the United States and around the world. And so just as an example of that, I've looked at folks, organizations, individuals that are referred to as climate contrarians. That's the term that I prefer. I mean, other people use denial, skeptics, but you kind of get the picture. And so I've tracked how these climate contrarians influence media coverage of climate change. That's kind of a first cut of work that I've done over time. And then I've actually gone into some of these meetings. One group in particular, the Heartland Institute, which is a right-wing multi-purpose organization, but focusing in on climate change. I've gone to some of their annual meetings and listened in on their talks, better understood their perspectives of contrarianism in a variety of ways, and interviewed several of the speakers to understand their motivations, to understand their impact, and to understand the kind of effects that they have in the U.S. policy arena and in terms of how they then are influencing the public sphere and how people talk about and act on information about climate change. And so you're absolutely right that lobbying, I focus in on that lobbying that is seen as obstructing, impeding, distracting from, delaying concerted policy action. There's certainly lobbying across the political spectrum, though, that lobbying that influences more progress and more aggressive action on climate change, more urgent action.
I made a note about that. So the Heartland Institute, and dove in kind of a little bit on some of I think you wrote a journal article about it, and you looked back. So maybe you attended their annual conference 10 years in a row, or was that right?
No, it's twice across a 10-year period. So
I see.
2011, 2021. Yeah, not 10 years in a row. That would have been for anybody, I think.
Yeah, that would be rough. But did you get a sense kind of, from that, and then maybe backfilling some of the stuff that they published in between about how the narrative has changed, or has it changed from the contrarian side?
Yeah, I mean, for listeners who want to dig into that paper, I hopefully have written it. It is an academic journal article, but I've hopefully written it in a way that's accessible for people to have takeaway points. But yeah, there's some things that have stayed the same and some things that have changed. Just to give you a couple examples of each, that in terms of things that have stayed the same, some of the speakers have remained the same. Some of their slides and arguments actually have remained the same over time. In part, that can be seen as an aging contrarian group. Others have written about the way in which climate contrarians tend to be older white men. And so there's a piece there. That the arguments haven't changed is partly attributed to the evidence and the facts that it's really a lot of their motivation is to muddy the waters of productive action on climate change. And so continuing to roll out some of the hackneyed and tired arguments, that it's too expensive to take action, or that they question humans' role in a changing climate, continue and persist. In terms of things that have changed, though, I think one of the key pieces just to share with you and your listeners is that they have changed up strategies, that there was a much more national, international focus, engagement with sending out pamphlets to educators around the country, here in the United States and such, and really being out front in the spotlight of influencing decision-making and policy action. I think that I've observed and written up about how they've really moved into small ball, if you will, to use an analogy from U.S. baseball, which is to say that they've moved into state and local efforts, which may not be seen, may not be as visible, but are nonetheless still part of a strategy that institute and many other right-wing organizations have taken up as they're seeking to influence policy across from our local communities up to national and international spaces. And so it's part of it feeds into other strategies that we can see within beyond climate change within some of these movements. There is a Project 2025 here in the United States. And so what I had observed and written up a few years ago is consistent with what is evident in Project 2025, which is moving across these different scales of engagement and influencing policy and influencing the way that everyday people are considering climate change in their lives.
It makes me think also of Sinclair Media buying up all these kind of local news channels or, local channels and syndicating kind of a right-wing perspective across, thousands and thousands of these channels. And it has that kind of folksy, homegrown feel to it, but it's actually coming from a very centralized voice.
It's an excellent point. Yeah, that's another piece of this. And it can be kind of, easy, convenient to dismiss some of the people that are involved here, some of the speakers, as just goofy folks that just don't have their handle on really accurate information about climate change.
I think we learned our lesson about not taking people like that seriously, especially
exactly
in the top office.
There you go. Yeah.
So, but you keep a close eye on media, and you also publish an annual review of media coverage of climate change and global warming. So this is a report in the Media and Climate Change Observatory, which you mentioned before. And last year, so in the 2023 report, one of the takeaways was that the hotter the world gets, the less media covers climate change. Do you want to talk a little bit about kind of what was in that report and some of the trends you're seeing over time with media?
Sure. Yeah, we've seen spikes in trends. If folks are interested in going to look at our website, we've got a bunch of different ways of taking a look. They're interactive figures that you can download, that you can start to use for your own purposes. And then we have our baseline data sets that, with a partnership with our libraries here, we've been able to offer them as open access data. And so there's a lot to dig into there, but there have been ebbs and flows. There have been spikes and there have been downturns over time. Generally, there has been an increase since we started tracking it. And in certain cases, our monitoring picks up in 2000. I've written a fair bit about where coverage really started to pick up in the late 1980s for several different reasons. But we continue to track it now across really 5 different themes, one being political themes. If policy actor, political elected official has something to say about climate change, it generates news coverage. Economic dimensions of climate change, decarbonization that's associated with it, energy choices, cultural dimensions of climate change. That can be social movements, that can be those everyday spaces, those kinds of stories that come up. Scientific stories, certainly new papers that are influential, research that's coming out, an IPCC assessment report, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has tremendous influence. And then finally, a big one throughout time has been ecological or meteorological events. And those are like the hurricane that I referred to, but they can be floods and droughts and other types of issues that generate media coverage that is connected with climate change. So with this group that we've developed over time, I was over at University of Oxford before this job. That's where the project had started. And looking through the UK and Europe and now building this out to over 120 sources across nearly 60 countries and in 14 languages, that it's mainly newspapers, but also television and radio, where we attempt to put our finger on the pulse of how and why news coverage is cropping up. So what you would refer to our annual reports, we've now had 7 years of those reports, and we've had monthly reports that lead up to them that we post all the time. And that it's a way to have a first cut of our understanding of what's generating news coverage. And then from there, our group, and we encourage other researchers to grab a hold of those data and then dig into other studies. So our group has done all kinds of offshoot studies of looking at more into the how and why coverage has been as it has been. And so it's turned out to be, I think, a productive contribution that we've made. It's been taken up and used on the floor of the U.S. Senate and in international meetings, in the IPCC as well, and in other spaces. And so we're glad that it makes that contribution. We hope it'll continue to do so.
Amazing. And this is a group of 24 people, academics and scientists around the world, I think you mentioned.
That's right. And the details, I'd love to name check each one of them because they all make a an important contribution, but the details you can find on our website if folks want to go take a look at it.
Yeah, perfect. I'll put that in the show notes as always.
Thank you.
Shifting gears a little bit. So you're a proponent of using comedy to engage people in climate change. And it was actually Stuart Goldsmith, who's been on the podcast, who put me in touch with you. And so not only do you believe in the power of comedy and this messaging, but you also have a course on this at the university. Talk about that. I think that will be surprising to some listeners.
Yeah, I'm so glad that Stuart connected us up. Stuart is a talented and super sharp person who's been innovating in these spaces. And of anybody, he's one to look to for insights about how this works effectively. He's great. We being theater professor Beth Osnes here at the University of Colorado Boulder, she and I, we're going into our 10th year of experimenting with comedy as a way to communicate effectively on climate change. And so we were drawn into it in different ways. I sort of described a bit of my own backstory of looking at how media cover climate change and looking at how these different channels can influence behavior. Beth had come at it from performance she actually has taught courses on the history of comedy as performance. And so we teamed up together to interrogate how comedy could leverage greater engagement and change. We partnered with our own students in our classrooms. We have a course that's called Creative Climate Communication, where we over the years have now put our students on stage. We scaffold and prep them so they're not just out there on their own, but we work through different ways to approach serious issues around climate change, but using the tools of comedy to help leverage conversations about solutions, conversations about their place in the contradictions that we're living in, and on and on. And for younger people, our target audience primarily, it certainly reverberates out. For younger people who have been born into a world where this has been in the public sphere, in public conversation since they were little, and then a lot of them majoring in environmental studies here, it weighs heavily on them. So this gives them a place to find their voice, to express themselves, a range of emotional reactions from their frustrations and their worries across to their ambitions and their hopes for the future. And so it's been this really productive and fertile place for us to engage. We don't trivialize climate change in doing this, but we play with it, as Stuart demonstrates, to be able to open up these conversations. And so we ended up partnering with Stuart and several other professional comedians as the coronavirus pandemic hit. We pivoted into an online environment just like the rest of the world. And we ended up starting to hire in working comedians that were underemployed during that period of time. And we basically developed these writers' rooms with our students where we could exchange information. Our students would get ideas from these professional comedians for their performances. And then folks like Stuart would use those interactions that influence the work that they're doing back in the UK. In his case, we've partnered with folks in Los Angeles, in New York, in DC, for shows that they've done that we've then supported over time. And it's proven to be a very popular course, for one thing. It's proven to be a place that garners a lot of interest. We have an international video competition that's also going into its 10th year, and we've had entries from all over the world, which is also a fascinating way to see how different communities, different cultures are interpreting these considerations around how to harness comedy for climate action. But we continue to press ahead with it because we see it as a place where we can walk this tightrope between sites of subversion and sites of sedation, where we need to engage young people and everyone with what sometimes with comedy, it's this licensed transgression, if you will. It's this way to poke at and prod at incongruence, the kinds of contradictions that we're all living in and trying to make sense of. And so that's been driving a lot of our work. We, as part of our work as researchers and teachers on this campus, that we've been also researching what works, how, when, why, under what circumstances. So we publish a lot of that work over time. And we continue to press ahead in partnership with comedians like Stuart and others as we see this as a way to provide a little bit of emotional salve, but not to distract our students from the critical importance of addressing climate change now.
I'm a big believer that humor is one of the key ingredients to resilience. And if I look at the people who've been working in climate change for a long time, a lot of them have just wicked gallows humor, that pops out at the reception at after a couple of glasses of wine at the reception at a climate tech conference and stuff like that. And you kind of have to, right? Because otherwise the weight of the world, literally, it's such an important mission, and you need to kind of blow up the steam somehow. And humor seems to be a pretty effective way to do that.
It's well said. I mean, the gallows humor is one flavor of many approaches to comedy. That's one way to approach it. Satire is pretty common. There's also this idea of good-natured comedy that my partner in this, Beth, has really been pushing forward to focus in on the contradictions we're living in. But you're absolutely right. It's a way to be resilient. It's a way to share our concerns and our hopes in ways that resonate with other people.
Now, I'm going to ask you this question, right? But is there one joke that stands out from one of your students over the years that you want to share?
Yeah. There's so many. And I'm glad that you'll put some links in the show notes. I invite listeners to check out. We have so many different clips from the live performances from our professional comedian partners as well. And then on a YouTube climate comedy channel, we've got our full shows over the last years that are available for people to check out. I would say one of the most adept and talented people working in these spaces is our primary professional partner, who's Chuck Nice. He's co-host of Star Talk with Neil deGrasse Tyson, but he's also been showing just how you can tell jokes about climate change and science effectively. So check out the work of Chuck Nice. But when I think about our own students, there's so many different performances. So what we do is we have students, they can choose between stand-up or sketch comedy. And in our own students' kind of lived worlds, there's sketch comedy about parties that they have off campus and ways that they're talking about climate change there and plastic cups and on and on. Or they're doing sketches about dating shows, that's kind of common too, or other shows. But then we have stand-ups that surprise us sometimes. And so I think in particular to your question, there was a student that we had, Tommy Lee, who came into the class, and he was a self-proclaimed car guy. But he wanted to move into these spaces and talk about the movement between cars as he knew them and appreciates them into the electric vehicle movement. He focused in and had this brilliant stand-up act that folks can find online. It was short, but he was basically saying, I'm a car guy, so I know how car people think. And car people claim that electric cars have no soul because they hardly make noise, that car people love that engine and get pumped up and want to shout, America, and that sort of thing. You can watch it from him yourself. And he talks about these behaviors around rolling coal, which maybe your international audience doesn't know about, but it's a way to increase the smoke coming out of your tailpipe to pour on to bikers and walkers. It's a really terrible thing. He gets into that. But then he talks about how the EVs have that backing up. Some of you may have heard that just kind of humming noise that helps people know that there actually is an electric car that's around safety. And he kind of toys with that to get at some of the funny parts of how we're transitioning as a society into that humming noise being kind of the new roar of the engine. And so, well, I'm not going to just straight up maybe tell you a climate joke. I think that piece by Tommy Lee, and there's many others that I could talk about of students' work that has been done that we've got captured on our websites. I will say that if you plug in, ChatGPT and all the rest of those GPTs, all the rest of the generative AI tools, if you plunk in climate change joke in there, you can get some really nonsensical, pretty bad jokes. I plunked it in as an exercise just to kind of see what comes up over and over and over, and they don't make sense or they're just not very good. And it reminds me of just the creative power of us as humans. Maybe the AI will continue to improve and, things will change. But at this point, it's bringing in our lived experiences, and particularly students bringing in their experiences in these spaces that create content that Beth and I and others couldn't come up with ourselves. And that's something that we continue to try to champion and promote here.
I do, consulting work and talks in accelerators and stuff like that about investment readiness and pitching and these types of things. And sometimes it's a lot of content, I have a half-day workshop on due diligence, and you can imagine, for investors, that can get, that is at risk of being a bit dry. And so I really try to put a lot of humor in there and, some ridiculous case studies and stuff like that to keep things light, because it's a way to keep people's attention, to engage them. And so, when I talk about pitching and investment readiness, and a lot of times people think I'm going to first start with like opening an Excel sheet and talking about, net present value of a company and these types of things. And mostly what I'm talking about is storytelling and finding ways to, get your message across, get all these data points across without it feeling like you're hitting me over the head with stats, right? And going from one slide to the next with here's 5 numbers, here's 5 more numbers, here's 5 more numbers, but trying to kind of thread the needle on this a little bit and make sure that people walk away having learned something and learned what you want them to learn, but without feeling like they've, they've just sat through a very boring lecture of numbers. And so I wonder, like, what else in your experience? So humor works. In my experience, storytelling works. What doesn't work is telling people they're wrong and they're stupid and this is why. What are some of the other ways that you can get through to people who might be contrarians or contrary and adjacent?
Yeah. And what you just shared is absolutely spot on. That's been our experience too. We have found comedy just to have this power to connect people, information, ideas, new ways of thinking, new ways of acting in the world. And like I said before, I mean, it brings forth multiple truths that we're sorting through in our lives and multiple meanings of ideas, statements, words that get uttered and like, hey, wait a minute, let's think about that together. It can also exploit cracks in arguments, bad arguments, and it can point to those kinds of issues as we're trying to sort through our everyday lives. I mean, some have joked in our classroom, like, the best environmentalist is one that just stays in bed all day and doesn't contribute to emissions. But what are we going to do? There's a contradiction. We need to productively contribute to society. And so comedy helps us get into those spaces instead of putting up our defenses when maybe we're told you're wrong about this. Comedy can kind of creatively work our way in and say, well, have you thought about it in this way? This is my experience. This is the story of how I ended up coming to this understanding. It can help lower those defenses and help connect up and bring people together. Because ultimately, this is a collective action problem. And we need to be talking about it. And if we're not talking about it and if we're not thinking about it as a collective action problem, we're not going to get anywhere near the kind of scale of responses and actions that are needed to address it.
You spent a few months last year at Yale's campus in Singapore. And one of the things you've talked about or touched on here is kind of the cultural lens of climate change and how that's viewed in different places. I wonder, being halfway around the world, did that change your perspective in any meaningful way, or, with maybe 1 or 2 examples?
Yeah, that's right. And not only in Singapore, so it's a privilege to be here at the University of Colorado Boulder. And I had a sabbatical and I spent part of it there at Yale National University of Singapore and taught a few classes, one in environmental communication, one in climate policy. I actually just this past summer spent 15 days in Jerusalem and was teaching a class there at Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And that was a climate policy class, but also understanding cultural dimensions to engagement in these different spaces is really fascinating and beneficial. And so working with the students in Singapore, as you mentioned, in the environmental communication class, I had put to them putting together some comedy around climate change as well. And it's a very different political, cultural context. It is not a democracy. Right to protest, civil rights are much different there. It's seen as a consultative, authoritarian state. And so from that place, we had agreed to keep it within the classroom environment. But with the kind of safe spaces of academic engagement with students, their perspectives about what they found funny, incongruent, contradictory in their lives, there were certain elements of connection around the world that we face. Singapore, for instance, being a small island that is forced to get a lot of its food from nearby countries, that has a large generation plant that's just to the south that people can look at all the time, and how they're getting their energy through natural gas is on their minds on a daily basis. How they can develop this highly industrialized society on a small island and engage in these ways with the global community generates all kinds of fascinating insights from students themselves. that I benefited from and that I continue to try and bring back into the environments here in Boulder, with you and your audiences, with the communities in Jerusalem, the students that I was teaching over there. And I think that's part of the exchange that helps us better work through these common challenges.
Amazing. And so I'm going to put a whole bunch of links in the show notes to the things that we talked about here. Anything else you want to add? Anything you're excited about, or ways that people can get involved in this mission beyond checking out the YouTube skits?
Yeah, check all that out. Reach out if anyone's out there is interested. We have our international video competition that just got posted up. I'll share it with you, Ryan, to put in the show notes so people could apply to that. It's got a long time to the deadlines in February, so you got plenty of time to put together great content, 2 minutes or less. Share it with everybody you know. It's a way to creatively start to make these connections across places. And so that excites me, that we now live in a world where we can make these connections much more readily and effectively across communities, across different perspectives, cultures, and across the political spectrum. That really excites me. I am really excited, genuinely about younger people today and their appetite for engagement on these topics and related issues and challenges and opportunities. And so I'm really pleased to have this, as I mentioned it, as a privilege, to have this positionality in this work, to work as a professor on this campus and as a researcher to hopefully advance this so that we can start to really affect change significantly. And that I see on the horizon.
Okay, I think for sure there are some listeners out there who have been looking for their opportunity to make their stand-up debut, and you've got it now. This is your chance. Max, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for this.
Thanks for listening to another Climate Tech podcast. It would mean a lot if you would subscribe, rate, and share this podcast. Get in touch anytime with tips and guest recommendations at hello@climatetechpod.com. Find me, Ryan Grant Little, on LinkedIn. I'll be back with another episode next week. Bye for now. This episode is supported by Grizzle, B2B content to create and capture demand. I first met Grizzle's founder, Tom Watley, 5 years ago at a conference in Dublin. I was so impressed that I signed a deal with him to do all my software company's content that same evening at the pub. Remember that, Tom?
Kinda.
And they're still doing it 2 years after we sold the company because the new owners love Grizzle as much as I do. If you sell B2B, book 30 minutes in Tom's calendar at grizzle.io/climate. That's GRIZZLE.io/climate.